Hey, I'm Matt at Mr. Maple.
And I'm Tim at Mr. Maple.
And today we're coming back with another Mr. Maple video. Today we're discussing why isn't my Japanese maple growing? If you hadn't already, take a second, like, subscribe, and share. We greatly appreciate all those shares. And as always with our videos, this is just the beginning of the discussion. You can continue the discussion in the comment section below. We greatly appreciate that.
And by sharing this with your gardening friends, you can help them figure out why their Japanese maple might not be growing. Also, make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel and make sure you're subscribed to our weekly emails on MrMaple.com. We had 10 new exciting trees every Tuesday at 10 a.m. That's something you'll definitely want to check out.
So, firstly, I'd like to cover that one of the options might be that your Japanese maple is simply a very dwarf variety and there's not a lot of growth on it because it's a very small, compact form that isn't supposed to grow very big. You may be more used to trees that are going to be at a much more accelerated growth rate than a Japanese maple. You may be looking at something like a Makawi Etsubusa or a Crimson Queen and going, why isn't this just leaping already? And it's a tree that is a relatively slow grower, especially in many different environments.
And the reason we're asking this question is because this is a question we get quite a bit. Why isn't my Japanese maple growing? And sometimes it is simply that you've got a dwarf cultivar that doesn't grow very much. If it's listed at being 3 to 4 feet in 10 years, you're talking about a plant that's growing less than 6 inches of growth in a year. And so it's going to be a very slow growing tree.
Something to be conscious of. You know, it's definitely something that I think some people mistake because they may be used to faster growing trees. They may be used to, you know, Acer rubrums or silverleaf maples and just that huge growth rate they're seeing with those in their environment. And then they've planted a dwarf Japanese maple and it's not, you know, it's not putting on 2 feet of growth a year. So in perspective, it seems like a very slow grower. And that just may be that you're looking at a cultivar that is fairly slow growing. Now, for context, there's definitely dwarf Japanese maples and very fast growing Japanese maples. We have some foot trees that are 2 to 3 foot in 10 years and some trees that'll put on 1 foot to 1.5 foot of growth a year. So it's a very relative statement there on the cultivars. There's certainly plenty that are going to get out there and grow very quickly.
Now, with that being said, there are different cultivars that have different growth rates. But also, how long has that tree been planted? Often Japanese maples may take a year or 2 years to get established before you really start seeing a lot more growth. So those first 1 to 2 years, you may just see a smaller amount of growth as it's putting roots out to get established and take water nutrients up for itself.
Now, Japanese maples have very non-invasive root systems, so it's not a plant that's going to push, you know, or be obstructive there in the landscape. But it's also something to be conscious of the environment around those roots. So if those roots are very restricted, you know, by concrete, by a large pot, or even other plants that may be, you know, crowding the Japanese maple roots, that can certainly slow your growth rate. Essentially, if you keep a Japanese maple in a container, you're going to create a bonsai-like condition where you're going to keep the tree a little bit smaller than it would be in the ground.
And if you have that same restricted area in the ground, it's almost like growing in a container, and your Japanese maple will be smaller overall. So that could be what's going on, why your Japanese maple isn't growing. Japanese maples are very easy to grow, and they're very easy to grow out in the landscape and garden, but often people are asking that question, why isn't my Japanese maple growing? And there's a number of different reasons.
Yeah, the first thing we always look at is the roots. Is something restricting the roots, or are the roots possibly staying too wet? And that seems like an obvious answer to a lot of people, but you'll be quite surprised how quickly the conditions in your yard may change. So it may have been something where your tree had very good drainage for quite a while, but something's changed a little bit in the yard, and now that area tends to be ponding more. So be conscious of changes like that in your landscape. If a Japanese maple is staying too wet, it's going to become more stagnant in its growth. It's going to slow that tree down. It may lead to root rot if the tree is saying soggy at the base of it. And that's definitely something we can see slowing down the growth of a Japanese maple. And it may be something that's changed from a previous season too. So just be conscious of that.
Often one of the biggest things that we see change from season to season is people starting to put mulch on their Japanese maples. If you do that volcano of death on a Japanese maple where you just start to pile up mulch on top of it, you're going to have a plant that's going to be much slower growing, especially you're going to see it start struggling more and more during those summer months.
Now that's important to note with a grafted Japanese maple. If you're growing something that's a low graft upright. Now, we get into a little bit in other videos like uprights and being low grafts and then sometimes being high grafts. But the main thing is not burying that base. That matters less than not wanting to bury the graft or the base of the tree. If you're continually adding a layer of mulch every year and you're continuing to bury that tree deeper, that tree's going to have to put energy into putting roots higher up to maintain itself. So what's going to happen is you're going to be basically essentially continually rooting your Japanese maple over and over. And so it's going to slow down the growth rate of your tree if you're burying that base. And that's true with a high graft or a low graft, if that makes sense. So you want to be very conscious to not be adding layers of dirt above the soil or the original soil layer.
Japanese maples, their roots really like oxygen. And if you bury them over and over and over again, like Matt's saying, this is going to be a reason that's going to slow down your Japanese maple drastically. Long term, it may even kill it if it's too much. And so that's one thing to keep in mind, is you may have too much mulcher on it, and by raking that mulch away, you can actually help that plant really perform well out in the landscape.
Yeah, over time soils can become more compacted, so it's always good to add nutrients to the landscape and then continue to like maintain good soil conditions around that tree. A lot of times with very old Japanese maples, part of the reason why they start to shut down is that the soils become so compacted around them and they're not getting that airflow. So it is something to be conscious of, but you still don't want to be burying that base and raising that soil level. Over time, I've seen people do it with like a butterfly, and they continue to plant, mulch heavy around the tree. And if you expose what's going on there, you have these little microfibrous roots trying to start, 6 inches up the base of that tree. And essentially, you're taking a lot of your growth and energy that you should be putting into roots and top growth, and you're putting them into re-rooting the tree.
Now, the other thing is have you been fertilizing your Japanese maple? If you're not fertilizing your Japanese maple, it may not be putting on a lot of growth. Or if you're putting on a fertilizer that doesn't really have much nitrogen, I'm talking like 3 or 4, you're really not giving a lot of nitrogen to begin with. We like to use something that's around that 10 to 15 range on the nitrogen. In the early spring, right as it's leafing out, that's a great time to fertilize, and you're going to get your maximum amount of growth for fertilizer from it when you fertilize during that time of the season. If you don't fertilize a Japanese maple, it will be even more slow growing.
And that may be what you're going for.
Yeah, and Japanese maples, by giving them fertilizer, you can add vigor to the plant and really get that plant growing and doing some fantastic things. But fertilizer is something that adds a lot to a Japanese maple and gives it extra energy. I mean, that's why we fertilize, is to get that extra growth on Japanese maples. So it may be that you haven't fertilized. Also, if you over-fertilize a Japanese maple, you put a whole bunch of fertilizer on it, it will shock the tree. And so maybe that you've put too much fertilizer on the plant, and that could be one of the reasons why it's not growing.
So getting into a few other ways to get some more vigor into your tree, light pruning in mid to late March is an excellent way to put more vigor into your Japanese maples. We tend to go through and lightly prune. We'll be doing a whole video on pruning soon, but we lightly prune and we take out a lot of the twiggy or conflicting growth. And by doing that, you're going to add a lot more vigor to your tree. Now, definitely don't over-fertilize your Japanese maple. Oftentimes, lightly pruning and then go with a moderate amount of fertilizer is the best way to put a lot of vigor into your tree that you feel might not be growing.
Now, one thing to keep in mind too, if you've got a Japanese maple and you think this tree hasn't grown at all and I've had it a number of years, well, it could be that it's lacking vigor for one of these reasons we've talked about. But you have to realize that every time that tree leaves out, it actually grows a little bit. And then it flushes again during the summer. So Japanese maples flush once in the spring when they leaf out, and they actually put a little bit of growth on then, and then they flush again during the summer. And so you actually are getting growth, but what we need to do is maximize the growth by giving it some fertilizer, give it some light pruning, and you'll get longer flushes of growth during those 2 flushes during the year.
One thing that always amazes me as a gardener is taking photos of our garden, especially like our parents' garden over at Maplewood Gardens, and comparing that over the years. And so oftentimes you'll feel like something like a waterfall might not be putting on a lot of growth that year, but then you look back at previous year's pictures and you're like, wow, this thing has really grown. A lot of people come to Maplewood Gardens, and one of the funnier things people tell me is, it used to be bigger, and because all the trees have grown so much, so the garden has gotten smaller over the years. Now, there's certainly cultivars. We talk a lot about Germain's gyration is one. If you want to see some immediate growth rate for a lace leaf, that's a great one to look into because it's going to leap. We did a video, and then we come back and did another thing for Growing a Greener World, and since we had shot the video, to a year later, the tree had grown like a ton. It looked completely different. And so there's things like that where you can focus on cultivars that are going to get out there a little bit more if that's something you're interested in. But a lot of people may be looking for the dwarfer cultivars, so there's nothing wrong with some of these that are going to stay a little smaller and a little more compact.
And especially if you have a smaller space, it's fine to have a slower growing Japanese maple in that space because it'll fit that space better than a much larger growing tree or a tree that you're just putting fertilizer out all the time.
Now, definitely keep in mind that if you're keeping a Japanese maple in a container and you're not root pruning it, eventually those roots are going to become more restricted and slow down the growth. They can get a little bit pot bound in a bigger container, so keep an eye on your drainage. Those roots can grow into the drain holes and things like that over time. And all those things can be contributing factors, especially if it's in a pot and you feel like that growth rate's really slowing down. It may be time, in early spring, even maybe in late February, to do a light root pruning and then put it in a bigger pot, or keep it in the same size pot depending on how much root you took out.
Yeah, we often say they're kind of like goldfish. They grow to the size bowl you put them in. You put them in a small bowl, they're not going to put on a lot of growth. And
people will come up to me too at garden shows and they'll say, how long can I keep this in a container? And I'll go, well, this here's a 20-year-old tree and it's never been in the ground. So it's certainly something that can be done. So don't be afraid to do that, but just be conscious of the steps along the way to look for.
Yeah, and Japanese maples, they're really easy to grow. They're slow growing. I mean, that's one of the things that people love about Japanese maples is they fit in a lot of small spaces. But there, like Matt said, there are some varieties that do grow quicker. So if you are looking for one that goes quicker, maybe it's best to start out with one of those varieties that is a little bit quicker. And make sure you follow the tips on why my Japanese maple wasn't growing to figure out how you can keep it growing faster and doing better for you.
Hey, one quick tip we'll give you too on growing a Japanese maple faster. Oftentimes when people are discussing this, they're talking about a lace leaf Japanese maple. Now, an easy way to get a Japanese maple lace leaf to be larger faster is to stake up a central leader. So by staking a central leader on a cultivar like Crimson Queen or Tamukiyama, you can greatly increase the growth quite quickly, because Japanese maples that are weeping are going to cascade and make an umbrella from that uppermost point. So if you continually stake up a central leader, you can create a tree that's much taller and may reach your more desired height at a quicker pace than if you just let it naturally mound its way up.
And what we mean by staking is you take something like a stick or a bamboo pole and you put it right there at the base of the tree and put it in the ground. And then you can take some bread twist ties and you can actually go and lightly twist it on one of the branches that is a little more flexible to raise that up, twist it up higher and higher, and then when that plant pushes on growth, it's going to start cascading down from that higher point. Over time, those branches are going to harden off, and that's going to make, you can remove that stake, and the tree will naturally be taller. It's an amazing thing. It's really simple. We'll do that some this summer, some videos just on staking, but that is a great way to add some height to some of your weeping selections for sure.
Hey, we hope we gave you some confidence today in growing Japanese maples. The point of these videos is to make it easier for you to get information to you quicker, and we hope you're enjoying these. Again, this is just the beginning of the discussion. You can always continue the discussion in the comment section below.
We greatly appreciate you watching this video. Make sure you like, subscribe, share with your gardening friends. I'm sure they'll find this very useful. And also make sure you subscribe to our weekly emails, because that's where we put out all of our cool new neat plants. And if you like plants and you're watching this video, you're definitely going to be a part of that. Take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.